Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General Hospital. Today's program is part of our Climate Change and Health series, which is a special collaboration among the Blum Center, the MGH Center for the Environment and Health, as well as the MGH Institute of Health Professions Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health. Before I get started, I just want to go over a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, you may visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that you're in listen-only mode. Everyone has been muted so they can hear our guest speakers today. If you have any questions for our guest speakers, you may use the chat feature, which is located above your screen. We'll have time for them in the end. Only Blum Center staff and our guest speakers will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat box. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. Lastly, at the end of today's session, you'll be directed to a brief survey, which we'd like to ask you to help us complete. Your feedback is valuable to us as we plan future programs. Okay, so next I'm going to introduce you to our guest speakers. Today joining us, we have Dr. Suellen Breakey. Dr. Breakey is a distinguished teaching associate professor in the School of Nursing, as well as an associate director of the Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health at the MGH Institute of Health Professions in Charlestown. Her clinical background includes global health and critical care nursing. Dr. Breakey teaches in the Doctor of Nursing Practice and accelerated BSN programs with a focus on ethics, evidence-based practice, and population health. Joining us today, we also have Dr. Patrice Nicholas. Dr. Nicholas is a distinguished teaching professor and director of the MGH Institute of Health Professions Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health, as well as the co-director for policy and advocacy of the MGH Center for the Environment and Health. She teaches in the Doctor of Nursing Practice program and advises accelerated Bachelor of Science and Nursing students at the MGH Institute. She also serves at the MGH Center for the Environment and Health on behalf of the Department of Nursing and Patient Care Services. As part of our Climate Change and Health series, they join us today to give a talk on heat-related illness in a climate-changing world. So please join me in welcoming Drs. Breakey and Nicholas.
Thank you, Amy. We're delighted to join you along with our colleague, Barbara Belanger from Perioperative Nursing Services, who's in the audience and also working with the Center for the Environment and Health. And I wanted to share that the Boston Globe on Saturday had a fascinating article on climate change and health that featured the MGH's Center for the Environment and Health with quotes from the director, Dr. Jonathan Slutzman. Among his quotes was the fact that heat-related illness presents many challenges for the health of those we serve from the MGH community. So it's a very timely topic. We're facing exorbitant heat in the United States and across Europe. And Suellen will now launch our lecture, and we look forward to your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice, and thank you, Amy. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so we have had our introductions, and I'm going to build on what Patrice said about what we're experiencing today. If you saw the New York Times today, 55.8 million people are currently experiencing extreme heat in the contiguous United States. And we know that this week is going to be a hot one in Massachusetts as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about general considerations to stay safe. What are the causes of heat-related illnesses, how to recognize, how to intervene, and most importantly, how to prevent heat-related illness, because it is preventable and it is the health impact, the most prevalent health impact that's related to climate change. And we're going to talk about other factors that contribute to negative heat-related outcomes, and particularly if you have chronic illnesses or other conditions. So on average, and this number is probably going to rise, but on average, there are 702 heat-related deaths each year. And this amounts to, in addition, roughly 66,000 emergency room visits, and about 9,000 people are hospitalized related to heat. So factors that impact heat-related illness and other heat-related health outcomes include more high heat days, which we know we're experiencing, the urban heat island effect, which we'll talk a little bit about, and then also important to note are the compounding effects of heat and air pollution on health. And if we just look at the area in and around Boston, we're located, our Institute of Health Professions is located in Charlestown, which sits right beneath the Tobin Bridge. And so on high heat days, we're not only impacted by the heat and ambient air temperatures, but also pollution from the Tobin Bridge, as well as from Logan Airport. So these are important considerations. And as I mentioned, and as I think we are all learning and becoming much more aware of, there are hotter days ahead. And so this is a projection of how many high heat days we had in Boston, days above 90 degrees in 2019, and what the projected range is for 2050. And as I said, you know, we can see that these numbers are increasing. I mean, ironically, we've had a pretty nice, pleasant summer up until now, and now we know that the heat's going to be coming. So as the old adage says, it's not just the heat, it's the humidity. And so it's really important to look at both temperature and relative humidity and talk more broadly about the heat index. And so if you look at this slide, the y-axis is humidity, which today we're experiencing a pretty high humidity today. And then you look at the ambient air temperature outside. So the heat index is more of a measure of, when you take these two together, how hot it actually feels, and how that impacts your body physically. So you can see if the relative humidity is, 40%, and the temperature is 80 or 82 or across the board, you can see that those numbers don't differ too much, but they do go up. But if you look at a higher relative humidity, like today's about 75% relative humidity, then you can see if it's 84 degrees with a 75% humidity, then the heat index feels more like 92. And so those are important considerations when we think about our risk and susceptibility to illness. So the urban heat island effect, and this picture kind of depicts it here, but in cities, and in certain areas within cities, more so, you can see that there are more buildings, there might be less green space, less tree canopy. On high heat days, these buildings are probably air conditioned, which then generates more heat out into the environment. There's also usually more asphalt and impervious space located in urban heat islands as compared to other rural or urban spaces. And so because there is no tree cover, because there's more asphalt, which deflects more heat back into the atmosphere as well, these urban heat islands actually generate more heat and can be hotter not only in the day, but also at nighttime when compared to urban and suburban areas that have tree canopy and more green space. And having tree cover not only helps in terms of cooling, but trees also act as natural carbon sinks. And so they pull carbon out of the atmosphere, which is also beneficial. And you may have seen that there's a big increase in people putting green space on gardens and tree planting. And this is partly to mitigate the effects of these urban heat islands. It's also important to note that within cities, there are certain areas that are more at risk because of the urban heat island effect, and specific areas that have been kind of like disinvested in because of historic redlining, which is the discriminatory housing practices that happened, many years ago, but led to certain areas within cities as being not as rich and productive as they once were. And so certain areas within cities are particularly at risk. So in terms of populations who have an increased risk for heat-related illness and poor outcomes related to heat and air pollution, infants and young children under the age of 5 are at risk. Older adults, 65 years and older, people who are overweight, people who work outdoors because of their occupations, athletes who practice or play outdoors in hot weather. That's when you think about athletes, we also think about teenagers and young adults, pregnant people, people with chronic medical conditions such as heart or lung disease, or even mental health conditions or certain neurological conditions. They have increased risk. And then certain medications that they may be on may also perpetuate that risk. So for instance, diuretics, sometimes called water pills, medications for your heart or high blood pressure, and as I mentioned, medications for mental health conditions such as depression, and poor circulation can also put people at risk. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And also, as I just mentioned, certain communities of color, particularly communities where the effects of historical redlining still exist in terms of the lack of tree space, tree canopy and green space in addition. So every year, the Lancet puts out a report called the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, and they've been doing this since 2017. And it's a measure of the global impacts of climate change. And then within the United States, there are authors who then put together a United States specific policy brief to look at the health impacts related to climate change in the United States specifically. And one of those authors, Dr. Renee Salas, is a physician at Mass General. So in 2019, people over the age of 65 experienced 102 plus million more days of heat wave exposure in the United States compared to a baseline, which was a measurement between 1986 and 2005. And what this translates to is that heat-related mortality for older people has almost doubled in the last 20 years. And as I mentioned before, heat-related illness and poor outcomes related to heat are preventable. And so this presents a real opportunity for, at the very least, community engagement and community awareness so that people understand their individual risk. When we look at older adults, social isolation also increases the risk for heat-related illness. And so that's an important consideration when we think about prevention. I mentioned occupational exposure. And so when you think about occupations who are impacted by heat, we think about the military, number one, occupational workers, construction workers, firefighters, people who have to wear heavy uniforms as part of their work. And then we think about other people like farm workers who might not be United States citizens, or people who might not be aware of their OSHA protections, that all people who work outside in the heat, regardless of immigration status or what they're doing, should be protected by OSHA. And those protections include rest breaks, water breaks, time outside of the sun, shade breaks, etc. So you can see here that there have been, in terms of labor, there's also an impact. The other thing about occupational exposure is that these people, if people are working outside in these areas and they're not given access to water, shade, and rest, then that increases the risk for health outcomes as well. So we talked about heat index, and that's kind of what your body is feeling. So it's the combination of ambient temperatures as well as humidity. And this chart just shows you, when you're looking at heat index, how at risk someone may be. So if the heat index is between 80 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, then that's a time to use caution. Extreme caution between 90 and 103, danger between 103 and 124, and extreme danger after 124. And as the other thing that we saw in the news today, that in Europe, they're experiencing extreme heat. And today they're anticipating that the UK will be the hottest day in history in the UK, approaching 104 degrees. And so again, you can see that the effects that has on the body. Risk for heat stroke, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and other heat-related illnesses that we'll touch on. So how does your body respond to increases or changes in temperature? What's the normal mechanism that we call thermoregulation? And so what happens is that we maintain a pretty tight core body temperature, somewhere in the vicinity of 98 to 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately. And so if your body temperature begins to increase, then your body's response to that, as we all know, is to sweat. And so what's happening there is that the skin, which is the largest organ in the body, the blood vessels near the surface of the skin vasodilate, or they dilate, in order to kind of increase the evaporation of sweat out into the environment. And that acts to decrease the temperature of the body. And so this is our normal mechanism. And if there are things that interfere with that, then ultimately what will happen is the body won't be able to generate the sweat and the evaporation, and the internal core body temperature will continue to rise. So how we maintain this thermoregulation, because when your blood vessels dilate, what happens is, if you think of like a radiator, if you think of some of the components of the radiator are blocked, if you open those all up, you need more fluid in that radiator to get to generate the use of the radiator. And that's basically what happens with your blood vessels when they dilate. You need more fluid in your blood vessels in order to get to your heart, and so your heart can pump the necessary amount of blood from the heart. So this means that you need to drink more to get your blood volume to match up to that compensatory mechanism. And so if you don't have that, and the other thing that your body does is it increases your heart rate, and it increases the force of the contractions of your heart in order to generate and pump more blood into and through your heart. So if you are dehydrated or you're not drinking enough fluid, then your thermoregulation or your ability to maintain that core temperature will be threatened, which is really why drinking plenty of fluids is really, really important so that you can maintain that protective mechanism. You can also see that if people have, cardiac disease, then their mechanism their ability to maintain a core temperature would also be impaired. So it's just really important to understand how important it is to keep your circulating blood volume maintained. And the way we can do that in a preventative way is by drinking water. So heat-related illnesses are kind of a range of illnesses that are caused by heat, and they kind of occur on a trajectory from very, very serious to less serious. And we're going to kind of walk through a few of these. So heat stroke is the most serious heat-related illness. And this is when your body is just really not able to maintain thermoregulation at all. And so because there's been a decompensation, people who have heat stroke have a high body temperature, so roughly around 103 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. They have hot, red, dry, or perhaps damp skin. They have a fast, strong pulse, and that's because the heart is trying to compensate for not having enough blood volume. Headaches, dizziness, nausea, confusion, and they may also have a loss of consciousness. And so this is a medical emergency. And if you were to experience or see anybody who was experiencing these symptoms, you would call 911. The person is going to need medical care in an acute care setting. But in the meantime, what you can do is you can move them to a cooler place. You can put cool cloths or immerse them in a cool bath if you're able to do that. And if you don't want to give them anything to drink because at this point they are seriously ill, and you want to just do those supportive measures that will be taken over by the emergency response personnel who show up to the scene. Heat exhaustion is kind of like a precursor to heat stroke. It's less serious, but you need to address it, and you might need medical help depending on your symptoms. So in this case, people might be like very sweaty, cool, pale, clammy skin, fast, weak pulse. Again, the body is trying to compensate. Nausea and vomiting might be present, muscle cramps, a weakness, dizziness, headache, and fainting may also occur here. And again, you want to, if this is you or if you are with someone who is experiencing these symptoms, you want to move them to a cool space. You want to loosen up people's clothes. If you have the ability, you want to get some cool wet cloths on them. And you can give them some cool water and have them sip that to try to minimize dehydration if they're conscious at this point. So the goal is you want to do whatever you can physically to decrease your or someone else's core body temperature. And that might be enough, but if someone is getting worse or they're throwing up or their symptoms seem to be lasting a long time, if their temperature is going up, if you have access to a thermometer, then you want to seek medical attention. Because again, you don't want that to progress to heat stroke. Heat cramps occur if you're out in the sun and the heat, maybe you're exercising. So heavy sweating, muscle pain, spasms. This is where you just want to stop what you're doing, move to a cool place. So get into the shade, or better yet, inside where there might be air conditioning. You do want to hydrate because these cramps are caused by the dehydration. So you want to drink water or perhaps drink a sports drink, but you don't want to overdo it on sports drinks during high heat days. Maybe have a little bit, but water would be really important. You want to get medical help if your symptoms don't go away. Or you're on a low sodium diet that could put you at increased risk, or if you have heart problems. But if when in doubt, seek medical attention either by calling your doctor's office, or if you're concerned, then you would want to seek medical attention. Heat rashes can occur in high heat, and this is just little blisters that might be on your skin. Just stay cool, make sure the rash is clean and dry, and maybe put a little powder on the rash if that's useful. So you can kind of see how I went from the most severe to the least severe. But essentially, when in doubt, get medical attention. I wanted to talk a little bit about the combined effects of air pollution and heat, because and this picture in the middle kind of depicts what we're talking about, and we've all seen this at some point. But when we think about air pollution, what we're talking about is very, very small particles, and you might have heard these terms PM 2.5 or PM 10, and these are particulate matter that are very small, so less than 2.5 microns or less than 10 microns, so really small. And if you look at the picture, it gives you some sense of how small they are in terms of a human hair or a little piece of a beach pebble that you might find when you're at the beach. So because these particulate matter are so small, they have the ability to get deep into the lungs. They kind of pass by our protective cough medicine, and they're able to like embed into the lungs and cause injury over time. And so that's why air pollution is not good. And we know that what happens is air pollution worsens when we have these high heat days. And this picture just kind of shows you, so when we're talking about air pollution, we talk about PM 2.5, PM 10, and then we talk about ground level ozone, which is different from ozone in the stratosphere, which is what kind of protects us from UV radiation. Ground level ozone is not good for us, and combined with other like noxious chemicals can lead to increased air pollution. And then these can have health impacts on us as well. And the impacts that, so for instance, people, especially in older people, the impacts of heat may be underestimated because mortality and morbidity related to heat and air pollution these people may often present, for instance, to the emergency room with stroke, with a heart attack, with other issues that may have been exacerbated by the air pollution and the heat. And so that could be underestimated. The impact of heat could be underestimated if people, if their illnesses look more like they're cardiac related or cardiovascular or cardiopulmonary related, things like asthma as well. So again, prevention is key to prevent all of these and to mitigate the impacts of heat and air pollution. So when it's hot outside, you want to wear lightweight, light colored clothing because that actually deflects the heat, doesn't absorb it. You want to stay indoors when it's the hottest. So if you want to go out for a walk or to get some exercise, early morning, or evening when things have cooled down. You don't want to go out in the middle of the day when it's the hottest, because that will increase your risk of developing some kind of heat-related illness. If you have access to air conditioning in your home, that's great. You should use it. For those who don't, perhaps going a trip to the mall, to the library. There are cooling centers around that are also accessible to people. And now, a lot of towns have heat warnings, and there should be postings to where you can locate a cooling center if you need one. And then also, taking cool showers and baths at home just to kind of keep yourself cool can also help. If you have shades on your windows, you want to put those down during, those really high heat times of the day where the sun is coming in. Pardon me about that. Everything you want to do is to just try to minimize your heat production and to maximize your coolness. I think I've already said this, but if you want to exercise, that should be done early morning or evening when things cool down. It's really important to stay hydrated. And we talked about the reasons for that is because that's a key and a critical way to maintain your core body temperature and thermal regulation. In older adults, we start to lose our thirst sense, our sense of thirst. That's a normal part of aging. And so if you are an older adult or you have older adults in your life, you want to remind them to stay hydrated, that they might not sense thirst, but that it's important to continue to drink throughout the day and not to wait till you're thirsty. You want to limit or avoid alcohol and sugary drinks because they actually dehydrate you. As I mentioned, sports drinks in moderation are okay. And I have here, remember your pets. Make sure that they're not going out at the, hottest times of the day. The asphalt can be really hot on their feet. So just keep them in mind as well. And then also, most importantly, if you do have a medical condition and you are on medications, it's important to talk to your primary care provider about how you personally what are the prevention strategies that are going to work best for you, especially around staying hydrated. Certain people may be on a fluid restriction, so you don't want to ignore that. You want to work in concert with your primary care team to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to prevent a heat-related illness, but you're not doing anything that will be harmful to you personally. And so to that end, and I talked about this a little bit before, but there are medications, and common ones include fluid pills and cardiac medications. These can impact your ability to, they can interfere with that thermoregulation process, but you don't want to stop any of your medications without talking to your doctor, or you want to review those. They might suggest that you hold something, but you don't want to stop anything, and you don't want to make any decisions without talking to your healthcare provider. So know the signs and symptoms, know how you can prevent this or at least mitigate the impacts of health related issues related to heat. Listen to your local news station for extreme heat alert, safety tips, cooling center locations. We hear, I would say even in the past few years, the meteorologists, for instance, are talking much, much more about climate change and about heat impacts. And so I'm sure you can get some information from your local news. Make sure you just pay attention to the weather so that you know what's coming and that you can prepare for that. And then also, if you have older neighbors, please check on them, or people who live alone or who may be isolated. You just want to check on people who you think may be at increased risk for developing a heat-related illness. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And Patrice, I don't know if you have anything to add to that?
I would add that there's also been in the local press information about elders and cooling centers. They do have a phone line from Mayor Wu's office that alerts elders in particular by phone. It actually goes to all City of Boston residents. And the cooling centers, they're actually thinking about creative ways to engage people in going to cooling centers. So for example, having bingo in a cooling center for elders, which often has an appeal to it. There's also an organization called Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, which I believe that the home area is in Dorchester. I'm just quickly looking for it to share that.
I think Mattapan too.
And Mattapan, thank you. Thank you, Suellen. And they are doing some very creative work to address climate resilience. So for example, they do offer air conditioners. They actually offered them here in our Charlestown community through the Charlestown Health Center. And I will also send this website to Amy because it's a very important organization. We know that climate change and heat stress disproportionately affect, as Suellen mentioned, all kinds of vulnerable populations, but in particular, elders and pregnant people, children. There's another resource that was on PBS NewsHour that talked about the fact that with every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature, school children are learning 1% less. It was a very elaborate study across the entire United States that used PSAT and SAT scores, which are taken more than once generally. And it demonstrated that children who are in schools that are not air conditioned are disproportionately affected by heat stress and learning less as well.
And the other thing I would add, which I didn't touch on, is that during episodes of extreme heat, there's an increase in emergency room visits for psychiatric illness. And there's also a direct link between violence and heat, which is an important consideration for healthcare providers, but also important just to note that people who have existing mental illness should kind of take note that they are also at increased risk as well. And these are things that people might not generally understand or be aware of.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I had shared a few resources in the chat, but there are actually a few more on what has been mentioned about schools, how it's all affected. If you're interested in the list of these resources, feel free to email the Blum Center at pflc@partners.org, and I'd be happy to share all those links with you. So we are now towards the end of the session. Thank you again so much. If you have any questions for Suellen and Patrice, feel free to enter them in the chat. We have a question regarding what role can community health workers and resource specialists have in supporting patients who are impacted by heat-related illness or extreme weather events?
That's a great question. And I think they can have a significant role, because if they're going into people's homes, for instance, they know their community. So if community healthcare workers and people who work within the community know their community, they'll have a better sense of what the risks are, because the other thing is not everyone is impacted the same when it comes to health impacts. And we talked a little bit about how there can be variations if you live on in an urban heat island. And the other thing that I forgot to mention is, without the proper amount of time to acclimatize to the heat, the risk becomes more severe. So like, when we have a 90-degree day in May, that's worse than a 90-degree day in the end of July or August, because, we're going from spring to there. But I think because prevention is so important and critical, or early intervention, I think that healthcare, community health workers have a huge role to play in increasing awareness, helping people look at their home, and adjusting accordingly. Like I said, if people have shades on the windows, those shades, it's best to put them down, between 10 and 2. So there's so much education that you can do with people around not going out during that time. If people live, let's say, like in a community for seniors, I'm kind of making this up, but it might be that they like to congregate outside together. But they wouldn't want to do that between 10 and 2, and maybe even a little later, depending on what the temperature is. So I think there's a huge role in community awareness, community education, and even individual education as they work with particular specific individuals.
Thank you. Patrice, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I would say that Suellen mentioned earlier, Dr. Renee Salas, who's an emergency department physician at MGH. She has been the lead co-author on the Climate and Health Lancet Countdown US brief. They have country-specific or region-specific reports, as well as the overarching Lancet report that comes out annually. Renee actually had a very interesting article in the Harvard Gazette, about the fact that she was working in the emergency department. And from Chelsea, we of course have the Chelsea Health Center. The emergency medical technicians, EMS, brought in an elderly man who lived on the 3rd floor in a 3-decker. And the EMS staff shared with her that when they went in after they received the 911 call, it felt as if they hit a wall of heat. And they brought the husband to the MGH emergency department. His wife was still in that heat stress environment, both elderly. And Renee Salas, as a physician and as a climate change and health expert, recognized that this individual was negatively impacted by extreme heat, and was able to immediately intervene and plan for what should be the care that this individual receives. So whether you're in the community or you're a healthcare professional, we all have roles in addressing education of people we serve.
Thank you.
I will just add one other thing to that. I think that the closer you are to the community and the more trusted you are, the more you can help to prevent and address these things. Because one of the things, we sometimes when you use the word climate change, it triggers people because it's like sometimes related to political issues and all of that. So the important thing isn't to realize that it's climate change related, but that it's going to continue to happen and get worse, and that people have to understand it. And so I just think having that relationship and that trust will actually make it easier for people to hear what and be more aware. And I think that those kinds of individuals, community health workers, have the ability to also advocate for people in their communities as well.
Thank you. What are some early signs of dehydration before it gets worse, where one can experience a heat-related illness?
So it depends on your age in some ways. So if you're a young person, let's say who's out on a hot day, I don't know, at a concert, playing sports, they will experience thirst. So and even in that population, they should be proactive about drinking fluids. But if you're thirsty, it's kind of, you're already on the path. So you want to kind of be a little bit more active, proactive. Dizziness, you might feel like your heart's racing, because remember, your heart's trying to beat more to kind of compensate. Increased sweating, if you think about that range, depending on where you are, if you're at the beginning of this, it's going to be, you're dizzy, you're thirsty, you're hot, you feel kind of fatigued. That's when you want to stop whatever you're doing, get to a cool place, drink fluids. If for an older person, they might, if they get thirsty, it's way late into the trajectory, because people who are older don't experience thirst, or they lose that over time. But it could be the same set of symptoms, cool, clammy skin. Again, if you have a thermometer, you can check your temperature, because that's going to certainly tell you a lot. Because if it's over, if it's rising or it's over around 99, 99.5, that, you're kind of shifting outside that core body temperature. If it's in the 101, 102, 103 range, then that's more serious.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on drinks like water, especially advertised with added electrolytes?
Those are not bad. If you're feeling dehydrated, I think typically and again, I'm also speaking from a place where you don't have any, these are general recommendations. If you have a known medical condition, you need to speak to your healthcare provider. But for the typical American person, adult, water is good. If you are playing sports, or let's say you're a runner, or you're sweating more excessively, Gatorade is not a bad thing. But as I mentioned, if you drink a lot of sugary drinks, like Coke and drinks like that, or even too much Gatorade, because Gatorade has sugar, then that can kind of become dehydrating. So you just want to kind of moderate that appropriately.
Thank you. Patrice, do you have anything you'd like to add?
We hope you'll join us for an overview of vector-borne illnesses. So thinking about Lyme disease, which is endemic in the Northeast. It's very common in the Northeast. We'll be talking about that next week on Monday at noon. Please join us.
Thank you. I'm actually going to include those details in the chat for anyone who's interested in joining us next Monday. So while we see if we have any questions in the chat, any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience today?
It's been wonderful to join you.
Yeah, and I would just say, I don't know who our audience participants are, but that big piece about also just consider other people in your family who might be at risk, particularly those who are older. Even if it's just to get the word out to them, like, hey, don't go out, don't go out when it's really hot, because that could be, that could create problems that you don't want to deal with, for sure. And it can be, really lead to serious injury and harm.
Do you have any online resources that you would recommend if someone wants to learn more about heat-related illness?
So a lot of what I took came from the CDC. That's a great resource. If you're, for people who you may know, or if you're like someone who isn't, your occupation puts you more at risk, like if you're someone who works outdoors, there's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They have some great resources. There's a lot of great resources out there, but CDC has some good stuff.
And in particular, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have an extreme heat guidebook that Suellen, I know you took some slides from the CDC about this. It's a very helpful guidebook geared for the general population.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Again, if anyone's interested in a list of these resources, feel free to email the Blum Center. We'd be happy to share that with you at pflc@partners.org. I also had mentioned that today's session is being recorded, so if you're interested in viewing that recording, feel free to visit our website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. All right, so I think it's okay to end a few minutes early. Suellen and Patrice, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully you found today's session helpful. Again, next Monday will be our next session on vector-borne illnesses. So I had included that Zoom link. Feel free to join us and we hope you can. Thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.